Long before those children vanished on Staten Island, everyone knew. Something was already watching, just waiting for the right moment. This story doesn't start with a legend. It begins with a city that felt deeply wrong long before anyone noticed. What happened on Staten Island wasn't random, and the story people tell today didn't appear by accident. This isn't just a myth, it's a heavy, uncomfortable truth. You're about to see exactly what happens when a community's fear finally finds a name for the thing that's been hiding in the shadows all along. Staten Island always felt like a different world, a place where the concrete of New York City finally gave up and let the trees take back the land. To the rest of the 5 boroughs, it was just a silhouette on the horizon, the forgotten borough, anchored in the gray waters of the harbor. In the years leading up to the change, life followed a rhythm that seemed unbreakable. It was a place of modest brick houses, narrow driveways, and families who had moved there specifically to escape the frantic noise of Manhattan. But there was a specific kind of silence that settled over the island once the sun dipped below the Verrazano Bridge, a silence that didn't feel peaceful so much as it felt expectant. The air on the island always felt thick, carrying the faint scent of the salt marshes and the industrial weight of the nearby kills. It was a landscape of strange, jarring contrasts. You had tidy residential streets where children played stickball until the streetlights hummed to life, but those streets often ended abruptly, giving way to dense, unmanaged woodlands and the sprawling, decaying grounds of old institutions that the rest of the world preferred to ignore. These were places of weathered brick and rusted iron, hidden behind overgrown hedges, where the paint peeled in the damp air and the windows stared back like empty eyes. People went about their lives with a quiet sort of exhaustion. They took the ferry. They worked the docks. They came home to dinner behind locked doors. There was a sense of isolation that wasn't exactly lonely, but it was deeply insular. Everyone knew their neighbors, yet there was a growing tension that no one could quite put into words, a feeling of being squeezed between the rising tide and the encroaching woods. You could walk down a street at 10 o'clock at night and hear nothing but the hum of a distant refrigerator or the wind rattling a loose chain-link fence. Nothing felt dangerous. Everything felt heavy. It was the weight of a place that had become a dumping ground for the things the city didn't want to see. The waste, the forgotten patience, and the secrets kept in the shadows of the greenbelt. The woods weren't just scenery. They were a constant, brooding presence. They were deep, tangled, and filled with the debris of a century. As the economy slowed and the social fabric began to fray, that heaviness turned into a collective breath being held. The island was waiting for something, though no one knew what it was yet. The atmosphere was prepared. The stage was set by the very dirt, the silence, and the isolation of the place itself. It didn't start with a scream. It started with a series of small, nagging inconsistencies that you couldn't quite bring yourself to report to the police because they sounded too ridiculous to be real. A mother would notice her son's jacket was missing, only to find it days later draped over a low-hanging branch near the edge of the woods, miles from where he'd been playing. A father would look out the window at 3 in the morning and swear he saw a figure standing perfectly still near the rusted perimeter fence of the old Willowbrook grounds, not moving, not waving, just existing in the dark. At first, people laughed it off. They blamed the wind, or the local teenagers, or their own tired minds. But then the stories started to repeat. You'd be at the grocery store or the local bar, and you'd hear someone mention a detail that matched your own private unease. It was always the same. A feeling of being watched from the tree line, a strange shadow that didn't move with the light, or a sudden, unexplained silence from the birds when you walked near the abandoned buildings. There was no mass panic. Panic is loud and fast. This was something much more corrosive. It was a slow-motion tightening of the chest. It was the way the neighborhood kids stopped wandering quite so far into the brush, and how the games of hide-and-seek ended a little earlier each afternoon. The confusion was the worst part. There was no clear enemy, no specific threat you could point to and say, "That's what we're afraid of." Instead, there was just a pervasive sense that the geography itself had turned hostile. The parents were the first to truly change. You could see it in the way they stood on their front porches, arms crossed, eyes scanning the street long after their children had come inside. They began to trade these half-formed worries like currency. Did you hear about the girl on the next block? Did you see the van idling near the park? Most of it was probably nothing, just the brain trying to find a pattern in the static, but the collective anxiety began to thicken. It sat in the back of everyone's throat like dust. You have to understand that the island, with its deep woods and its dark history of housing the forgotten, was the perfect petri dish for this kind of psychological dread. People were living on top of secrets, and they knew it. The abandoned institutions weren't just buildings. They were scars on the landscape that people were beginning to suspect hadn't fully healed. The fear wasn't about what was happening, but what could happen at any moment. When a community is under that kind of pressure, the human mind does something fascinating and terrifying. It starts to look for a shape to hold all that formless anxiety. It needs a face to blame for the heavy silence and the feeling of eyes in the dark. It needs a narrative to explain why the world feels so fragile all of a sudden. This is how a city prepares to create a symbol. They weren't just telling stories. They were building a cage to trap the fear that was already living among them. They were waiting for a name to give to the dark. That was the moment when the formless dread finally found a container. It didn't arrive with a thunderclap or a formal introduction. It drifted through the hallways of elementary schools and over backyard fences like a slow-moving fog. A name started to circulate, one that felt like it had been coughed up by the island's own soil.
Cropsey.
The name didn't come from a book, and it wasn't an ancient myth brought over from another country. It was a label for the unexplainable. It was a shorthand for every intuition that had told people to stay out of the woods and every shadow that had seemed out of place. Suddenly, the silence of the island had a face. But the strange thing was, nobody could agree on what that face looked like. The stories were as fractured as the landscape itself. In some neighborhoods, Cropsey was a former patient from the Willowbrook State School who had slipped through the cracks of a failing system and retreated into the miles of abandoned tunnels beneath the dirt. In others, he was a grieving father driven to madness, or a hermit living in the rusted remains of the old farm colony, hiding behind a mask or wielding a hook. The details shifted depending on who was telling the story, but the core of the legend remained remarkably consistent. Cropsey wasn't a character in a horror movie who went on a rampage. He was a presence. He was the thing you saw out of the corner of your eye when you were walking home too late. He was the reason the birds went silent near the overgrown perimeter fences. The legend didn't need to describe an attack to be effective. It only needed to suggest that you were being watched. He became the personification of the island's isolation, the physical manifestation of the heavy, expectant silence that had been building for years. People think we create legends for entertainment, but in Staten Island, the legend was a tool. It was a way for parents to finally give their children a concrete reason to stay away from the dangerous places. It was easier to tell a child to watch out for a monster than to explain the complex, systemic failures of the city around them. It was a way to organize the fear, to put a boundary around the dark and say, the danger lives there. The name gave the community a way to talk about the things they were too afraid to look at directly. By naming the shadow, they felt, perhaps for the first time, that they had some small measure of control over it. But the name didn't make the fear go away. It just gave it a home. It wasn't the monster. It was the warning. It was the city's way of acknowledging that the air had turned sour, and that the safety everyone had taken for granted was an illusion that was about to be shattered. For years, the name Cropsey was a ghost story used to keep children from wandering too far into the Staten Island Greenbelt. It was a useful fiction, a way to make sense of the dark. But in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, the fiction was stripped away, replaced by something far more terrifying because it was made of flesh, blood, and a history that the city had tried to bury. The shadow in the woods finally stepped into the light, and it didn't look like a monster. It looked like a man named Andre Rand. The transition from myth to reality didn't happen all at once. It began with a series of disappearances that felt like the legend coming to life in the worst possible way. Children started vanishing, not into the pages of a story, but from their own front yards and local parks. Alice Ferreira, Holly and Hughes, Tiara LeBron. These weren't just names in a newspaper. They were holes left in the fabric of the community. The confusion that had simmered for years boiled over into a cold, paralyzing dread. The police weren't looking for a hook-handed phantom anymore. They were looking for a person who knew the island's hidden places better than anyone else. When the search for Jennifer Schweiger began in 1987, the island held its breath. Jennifer was a 12-year-old girl with Down syndrome, and her disappearance galvanized the community in a way nothing else had. Hundreds of volunteers, people who had grown up hearing the Cropsey stories, walked shoulder to shoulder through the very woods they had been taught to fear. They weren't looking for a legend. They were looking for a child. The search eventually led them back to the grounds of the old Willowbrook State School, the epicenter of the island's collective trauma. It was there, in a shallow grave not far from where Andre Rand had set up a makeshift campsite, that the reality of the situation finally broke everyone's heart. Rand was a former employee of Willowbrook, a man who had lived in the literal and figurative shadows of the institution long after it had been shuttered for its horrific treatment of patients. He was a product of the very decay the island had tried to ignore. The shock of the discovery was followed by a silence, so heavy it felt physical. This wasn't the thrill of a campfire story. It was the gut punch of human depravity. The tunnels that were once rumored to house a boogeyman were actually being used by a real man to move unseen beneath the surface of the city. The woods weren't haunted by a spirit. They were a hunting ground for a predator who exploited the island's isolation and its willingness to look the other way. This is where stories stopped being entertainment. The emotional impact on Staten Island was transformative. The legend of Cropsey didn't disappear, but it changed. It lost its playfulness. It stopped being a rite of passage for teenagers and became a scar that wouldn't close. Every time someone mentioned the name, it was no longer followed by a nervous laugh, but by a memory of police sirens, search parties, and the faces of the missing printed on flyers that faded in the sun. The city had created a legend to explain its fear, but the reality proved that the fear had been justified all along. The tragedy of Andre Rand and his victims gave the myth a weight it could never shed. The monster wasn't a supernatural entity. It was a man who had been allowed to exist in the cracks of a broken system, proving that the most dangerous things in the world aren't the ones we imagine in the dark, but the ones we allow to live among us in the light of day. The meaning of the story had shifted forever, from a warning about what might be there to a permanent memorial of what was. Decades have passed, and Staten Island has worked hard to bury its heavy history under layers of new development and suburban normalcy. Today, the island is more crowded, the streets are better lit, and the crumbling ruins of the old institutions have mostly been reclaimed by nature or fenced off behind high-security perimeters. But stories are harder to demolish than buildings. The legend of Cropsey still exists, though it has split into two very different lives. For the rest of the world, the outsiders who only know the island through a computer screen, Cropsey has become a piece of high-end digital content. He is the subject of documentaries, the inspiration for horror films, and a staple of true crime podcasts. To them, it's a fascinating case study in how folklore and reality can collide in a spectacular, terrifying way. They visit the island like tourists of the macabre, looking for the thrill of a dark woods at night, safely detached from the actual weight of the history. But for the people who actually live here, especially the older generations who remember the sirens and the search parties, the feeling is entirely different. There is a quiet, unspoken avoidance that still dictates the rhythm of the island. You see it in the way a conversation will abruptly shift when a certain name is mentioned, or how a local will take the long way around a neighborhood rather than cutting through the edge of the greenbelt at dusk. It's not that they believe in a hook-handed monster. It's that they remember the day the monster turned out to be real. The newer residents, the ones who moved here for the schools and the commute, might not know the details, but they still feel the residual chill. There are pockets of the island, valleys where the fog settles a little thicker, and woods where the trees seem too tightly packed, where the air just feels different. It's a lingering discomfort that hasn't been scrubbed away by time. The legend has become part of the island's DNA, a permanent shadow cast by the past. It's a reminder that a community can never truly go back to the way it was before it knew what was hiding in its own backyard. Some stories never leave the places where they were born. They just settle into the soil and wait for someone to walk by. Maybe the legend of Cropsey never truly existed outside of the panicked whispers of a few frightened people. Maybe it was just a name, a phantom born of bad lighting and local gossip. But that's not the part that should keep you awake. The truly haunting realization is that the city needed him. Cities don't create monsters for fun. They build them out of necessity, usually when the reality of their own failures becomes too heavy to carry. When children vanish and the institutions meant to protect the vulnerable are the very places hiding the predators, the truth is too chaotic, too cruel to accept. A monster, however terrifying, is at least a story. A story has rules. A story can be tracked. A story gives you a face to hate when the alternative is admitting that the world is simply random and indifferent. And in Staten Island, what's most disturbing isn't the story people tell. It's why they needed it so badly. It was a bridge over an abyss of pure, unexplainable grief. Without the legend, they were just alone in the dark with a reality they couldn't live with. And if they needed to invent a monster back then just to survive the silence, you have to wonder what your own city is creating right now and what exactly it's helping you ignore.